This story is not a crime drama. It does not end with a gunshot or an eloquent trial. It begins with a silence that drives people crazy, where a girl disappears from the face of the earth, and the killer lives his life for more than 16 years. Rebecca Gould, a name that would have been buried in the police records if it were not for the determination of those who refused to give up. For 16 years, her killer lived outside the law, left the country, got married, had children, drifted on oil rigs in the Pacific as if no woman's blood had ever flowed through his hands. For 16 years, her family lived in a cycle of pain, and the police? They probably slept with insufficient evidence. The only thing that survived was the simmering anger of the public, of a journalist, a former police officer, and an online community that had never met Rebecca, but could not accept that injustice to continue for another day. No, this was not a simple murder. This was a living testament to the failure of the legal system when faced with a clever, cold, and cruel man, William Miller. He did not plan. He had no specific motive. But he killed, hid, cleaned up the blood, threw away a girl's body like trash, and then disappeared. What happened on the morning of September 20th, 2004, inside the house of Casey, Rebecca's boyfriend? Why was there blood under the mattress, traces of bleach spread throughout the bathroom, but the police still did not arrest anyone? Why was there not enough evidence to convict? We're going to go through the truth piece by piece, not to tell a good story, but to reclaim a voice for a girl whose life was taken away because she trusted the wrong person. If you're someone who's ever felt angry that justice is late, if you're someone who believes that murder can't be so simple as to get away with it, hold on to your feelings, because what Rebecca needs is not just a sentence. It's a final declaration: I'm not silent. I was murdered. And now it's my time to speak. In many murder cases, the victim is often blurred out, like a side detail to make room for the perpetrator, who is analyzed psychologically, investigated for motives, and portrayed as the main character in a tragic story. But Rebecca Gould is different. She cannot, and should not, be forgotten. Because her life is not the beginning of a case, but the center of it. Rebecca was born on April 28 in the small town of Melbourne, Arkansas, a peaceful, quiet place, but also the kind of place where everyone knows each other's business. She has 3 sisters, and from a young age, her family was not complete. Her parents divorced after the youngest was born. The daughters lived with their mother, but still visited their father regularly. It was not a perfect childhood, but it was not a dark one either. Rebecca grew up in a patchwork family, between deprivation and love. She was introverted, smiled gently, and was often silent. People who knew Rebecca described her in 2 words: gentle and nice. She was the kind of person you could call to help you move in the middle of the night, and she would show up with coffee and a smile. As an adult, Rebecca attended Northwest Arkansas Community College, along with her older sister. Her family was not well off, so she commuted back and forth between school and home to save money. That weekend, September 19, 2004, she decided to visit home like she had done many times before. The only difference, this time, she also wanted to stop by her boyfriend, Casey. Casey, at the time, was not a suspicious guy. He worked at a coffee shop, lived alone, and was someone Rebecca's family trusted. She had slept over at Casey's house many times when she was in town, bringing her beloved small dog and her bag of belongings. No one thought anything was wrong with the relationship. Perhaps that was the scariest part. Early the next morning, Rebecca was last seen at a gas station near Casey's workplace, buying a sandwich and coffee. The cameras picked her up, looking normal, as usual. And then she disappeared. When she didn't pick up her sister as scheduled to return to school, her family began to worry. They called, texted, but no one answered. At first, the worry was vague, maybe she overslept, or changed her plans. But by evening, the silence stretched like a wound. The next day, when all hope had been lost, her mother called the police. Rebecca Gould was not a main character in the film, she was not famous, there was nothing special to shock society with her disappearance. But because of that, she represented thousands of other girls, ordinary, rustic, and always thinking well of others. Rebecca didn't know that when she returned to that house where her trusted boyfriend was, she would enter the fateful end of her life. She didn't die right away. Death came later, silently, within four walls sealed with bleach, blood, and an unexpected bloodlust, but before that, she was still a normal person like you, like me. And perhaps, that's what makes this story so real. So close. So painful. The house where Rebecca Gould stayed that weekend was nothing special. A small, ordinary house in the old town, simple, quiet, near Casey's workplace. There was nothing to make people wary, nor did it create a sense of danger. That's why its coldness later became even more terrifying, like a monster that had pretended to sleep. Rebecca arrived on Sunday night, September 19, 2004. She stayed the night. The next morning, Casey said, she dropped him off at the coffee shop where he worked at around 8:30 a.m., then drove back to the house. Her plan was clear: pack up, call the dog, and then pick up her sister so they could go back to school together. But that never happened. When the police arrived the next day, the first thing they saw was Rebecca's car still parked in the yard. Her purse, her ID, her puppy, all were still inside. But Rebecca was not. From the outside, everything seemed normal. But inside, there was a commotion. The bedroom was unmade. The mattress was off the bed frame. When an officer gently lifted the mattress, dark, dried red stains were visible under the fabric. On the sheets, on the walls, on the floor, bloodstains, smeared like muffled cries for help. In the bathroom, the police found several bottles of bleach, the caps half open, and the strong smell of chemicals still lingering on the floor. This was not a routine cleaning. This was a clumsy but desperate attempt to cover up a crime. Casey said that Rebecca had come back to the house to pack up and would pick him up after work, but then never showed up. When he didn't see her, he assumed that she had changed plans and gone to a party with friends, an assumption, amid the blood? An assumption. When a girlfriend was missing and her belongings were still intact, the police initially suspected Casey, because he was the last person to see Rebecca, and because all the signs were around his house. But there were no witnesses, no cameras, no physical evidence. Even the DNA evidence was too rudimentary to be conclusive, and then, a detail that made everyone hold their breath: one of the piano legs in the room was broken. The old piano, placed against the wall, was bare, and missing a leg. A heavy, solid wooden leg. When the police later examined her, the wounds on Rebecca's head matched the shape and size of the piano leg, but it was gone. Someone had taken it. And Rebecca was gone. The house, once a haven for the young girl, was now a place where her blood had soaked into the wooden floor. No one had heard her screams. No one had seen the struggle. The killer had not broken down the door. There had been no sign of a break-in. The man had been trusted enough by Rebecca to let her in, and then, in an instant, an explosion of instinct, or perhaps cold planning, had turned the place into a torture chamber. Not a sound. No one had heard her cry for help. Rebecca had not had a chance to fight. She had been taken by surprise, beaten down, suffocated by her own trust. The killer had not screamed. His hands had not trembled. There was no hurry. There was no hesitation. It had all happened silently, cold as steel. There was no banging on the door, no screams for help. Just a girl packing her bags to go back to school, and a man walking through the doorway, carrying death in his chest. William Miller, no one expected that name at the time. A relative of Casey's, briefly seen, then retreating into the shadows. But it was he, not Casey, who was the real nightmare. Miller said he had come to Casey's house that day on the pretext of calling for help. Rebecca opened the door for him, without suspicion. She knew him. He had dined with the family. To Rebecca, he was family. To Miller, she was a target. No one knew exactly what happened in the next few minutes. But from his later confession, the grisly picture emerged. Miller pretended to need to make a call. When Rebecca went back into her room so as not to disturb him, he quietly followed. She sat on the bed, calm, unaware that behind her was a man frantically trying to suppress a murderous urge, and then, he couldn't, he pulled out the piano leg, the heavy wooden weapon, and hit Rebecca over the head again and again, without saying a word. Without letting her protest. Without letting her understand what was happening. The first blow probably knocked Rebecca unconscious. The next few were to make sure. Miller then strangled her, an unnecessary act if she was already dead. But for him, this wasn't killing to escape, it was killing to satisfy. There was no sign of sexual assault. No robbery. No apparent motive. There was only one urge deep inside him, to kill a girl who looked like Rebecca. And unfortunately, she trusted him enough to open the door. When the blood started to drip onto the floor, Miller didn't run away like an amateur. He stayed calm, more than usual. He went into the bathroom, got out the bleach, mopped the floor, the walls, flipped the mattress, cleaned up in every way possible. Not to hide the body, but to erase his own traces, the one who didn't live there, who had no reason to be there. After cleaning up the blood, he wrapped Rebecca's body in sheets, carried it to his car and drove away. In broad daylight, no one noticed, no one suspected. He drove through deserted roads until he found a highway off-ramp in Izard County, about 12 miles from Casey's house. No burial. No hiding. Just dragged the body out of the car and threw it on the grass like a bag of trash. That was all that was left of a 22-year-old college student who had loved, who had studied, who had a future ahead of him, and then, he went back to his life. A normal man, working on an oil rig, getting married, having kids, living in the Philippines, where no one knew that Rebecca's blood had been on his hands. No one found the killer at the time. No one knew where the piano legs had gone. And since no one saw Miller at Casey's house that day, the police could only look at Casey, and then nothing. The case was closed. Rebecca was buried. The family held a tearful funeral, but could not name their daughter's killer. The silence continued. Just as Miller wanted. When Rebecca Gould's body was found on September 27, 2004, a week after she disappeared, it was no longer a search, it was confirmation of their worst fears. She was found in a roadside ditch in Izard County, about 12 miles from Casey's home. The body was not buried, nor was it hidden. Rebecca lay quietly, wrapped in the same bedsheets that had been draped over her back every time she slept at her boyfriend's house. Only this time, it was a sheet wrapped around her body, a cold farewell from her killer, an autopsy determined that she had been hit hard in the head with a hard, heavy object. There was no sign of struggle, she had no time to react. She had then been strangled to death. There was no sign of sexual assault. No theft. No motive other than the desire to kill, and so the investigation began, but not in the way Rebecca's family expected. Blood in Casey's house? Yes. Bleach stains? Yes. Missing bedsheets, found wrapped around the body? Yes. The missing piano leg? Yes. Rebecca's body dumped not far from Casey's house? Yes, but Casey had an alibi, friends confirmed he was with them that night. And no one saw anyone else enter or leave the house. Rebecca didn't call for help. There were no surveillance cameras. The police recovered no DNA except Rebecca's and Casey's, who lived in the house. Casey became the prime suspect, but also the uncatchable suspect, and what about the others? Who would have known Rebecca was home at the time? Who would have had reason, opportunity, or familiarity enough to have opened the door without warning? It was a question the police never got to the bottom of. Miller, Casey's cousin, was in town at the time of Rebecca's disappearance. He had visited Casey's house. The police had talked to him. He claimed he was just outside the door, didn't go in, didn't know what was going on, and that was it. No one checked his exact schedule. No one looked into his past, which was rife with violence against women. No one suspected a relative, who was there at the right time, and knew exactly where the victim was. In the end, the case quietly fell into the unsolved category, a dry file and a few lifeless reports. Rebecca's family, heartbroken as they were, could do nothing but wait for a miracle of investigation from the police. But the miracle never came. For more than a decade, Rebecca Gould's case was passed from one agency to another. Each reviewer came to the same conclusion: there is not enough evidence to prosecute. A statement that killed hope faster than the killers. Were the police at fault? Maybe. But the biggest mistake is the acceptance that some cases will never be solved, and the dead will never be heard from again. On that basis alone, William Miller won. He killed, and got away with it. He managed to wipe the blood off the floor. He managed to hide his death-hungry eyes behind a veneer of kinship and silence, but he failed to account for one thing: the persistence of justice, not from the system, but from people outside it, a journalist, a former cop, a group of bloggers, and an online community that refused to let the victim be buried under a thick layer of records. Because the truth may be hidden, but it never disappears. Some cases are solved by DNA testing. Some are solved by confessions or security cameras. But some, like Rebecca Gould's, are solved only by the obsession of those who refuse to forget. 16 years after Rebecca's death, the silence has begun to speak. George Jarrett is an investigative reporter in Arkansas, who has followed the Rebecca Gould case from the beginning. Not because he was assigned to do so. Not because he was paid. He simply could not accept that a girl could be brutally murdered and no one would pay. George wrote dozens of articles, then a book, about the case. But he didn't stop there. He created a blog dedicated to investigating Rebecca's case, with thousands of followers. More than once, he was ridiculed for being overly obsessive. But it was that obsession that kept the flame of truth burning for more than a decade. Jennifer Buchholz, a former Colorado detective, stumbled upon the case through George's writings. Having worked in forensics and crime scene analysis, Jennifer was quickly drawn to the case. She realized something. The way Rebecca was killed and disposed of suggested that the killer had known her and had access to her. Jennifer decided to contact George. They began collaborating, not as journalists and cops, but as two people with a shared anger. They created a dedicated social media group, asking people to look for clues. And then, from the chaos of comments, a name emerged: William Miller. William Miller was not a complete stranger. He had been mentioned in 2004 as Casey's relative in town the day Rebecca went missing. But he was not suspected at the time. He said he had just stood outside, not in the house. No one investigated further. He disappeared from the records. But in George and Jennifer's Facebook group, Miller not only followed, he was extremely active. He sent private messages to the administrators. He commented on almost every post. He analyzed the case, even hypothesized who the killer was. To the average person, this might be pure interest. But to someone who had investigated crimes like Jennifer, it was alarming behavior. Miller knew too much. He knew more about the details of the scene than anyone else. He emphasized certain theories as if to direct the conversation. Jennifer began to question, why would someone living in the Philippines, halfway around the world, obsess over a small case in Arkansas? One of the group members, who happened to be a genealogist, looked up Casey's relatives on her mother's side. And then, William Miller, his cousin. When Jennifer and George learned this, they were stunned. William wasn't just someone who knew Rebecca, he was a close relative of her boyfriend, who had lived at Rebecca's house before she went missing. Miller lived in Texas in 2004. But records showed he was in town the weekend Rebecca went missing. He had been convicted of assaulting his ex-wife and assaulting a minor, but had never served long in prison. He then moved to the Philippines, got married, had children. And so, he lived like a ghost for nearly 2 decades. Jennifer and George took everything they found to Arkansas State Police. At first, they were ignored. But then, something unexpected happened. In 2020, William Miller returned to the United States, living in Oregon. Customs told police that the person named in the old file on Rebecca Gould had returned. The police called his mother. She said she hadn't seen her son. But they knew she was lying. The investigators decided to act, this time, not to let it slip away, and an interrogation plan was set up. One last chance, to unmask William Miller. William Miller sat before the Arkansas police, his face impassive. A middle-aged man who had lived comfortably for nearly 2 decades in the Philippines, now back in the United States as a private citizen. He didn't shake. He didn't dodge. He even appeared cooperative. "We just want to ask you a few questions about the Rebecca Gould case," the policeman began. Miller smiled. "No problem. I have nothing to hide." The interrogation began like any other, with soft questioning, probing reactions, tapping memories. But this was no ordinary interview. The investigators had set a trap, and if Miller took just one step, they would tighten it. The question came suddenly, like a bolt from the blue. Miller paused. His face paled slightly. His eyes darted quickly to the left, a reflexive response when the brain is faced with a threat. "Oh. Sure. If it helps." He chuckled. But the pulse in his neck didn't lie. While an officer pretended to call the chief to ask if there was a polygrapher nearby, Miller's anxiety became more evident. He began to change the subject, to ask questions, to try to maintain control. He didn't know that in the next room, a polygrapher was waiting. polygraphs, lie detectors, are not allowed to be used as evidence in court. But they are still a powerful psychological weapon. And this time, the investigators were using it as bait. Miller sat down, hooked up to a wire that measured his heart rate, his sweat, his blood pressure. The questions began. Did you know Rebecca Gould? Yes. Were you in Casey's house that morning? No. Do you know what happened to Rebecca? No. Did you kill her? No. The result? All lies. When the test was over, the officers walked in, coldly. You know, William. We found Rebecca's DNA in your car. Miller was stunned. It was a lie. The truth was that in 2004, the police had not searched Miller's car, and no DNA had been taken. But the law allowed police to lie when questioning suspects if it led to a voluntary confession, and it had worked. Miller was silent for a few minutes. He leaned forward, sighed. Then he said, I didn't mean to. I don't know what happened to me that day. Miller began to talk. At first he was timid, indirectly denying the charges. He said he had stopped by Casey's house to make a phone call, that Rebecca had let him in. Then she had gone into her room. I don't know why. I didn't plan anything. I saw her. She looked so much like. He paused. He said a rage, a strange urge, came over him, and he couldn't control it. He went into the bedroom, pulled out the piano leg, which had been loose, almost falling off, and hit Rebecca over the head several times. She lay there, unconscious or dead. He strangled her again, just to be sure. He said there was no reason. No robbery. No rape, just the urge to kill. After the murder, Miller took bleach from the bathroom, mopped the floor, wiped the walls, folded the sheets, all meticulously, but still leaving traces. He wrapped Rebecca's body, carried it to his car, and drove it down the highway like someone carrying laundry. No one noticed. He threw her body down a small hill by the side of the road, not burying it, not hiding it, because he thought no one would find it. And then he disappeared from town, from the country, and lived as an innocent man for 16 years. Miller was arrested shortly thereafter. Investigators knew he could recant at any time, if there was no physical evidence. And he did. Back in Arkansas, Miller denied the crime, saying he was induced into making a false confession. But it was too late. The entire interrogation was videotaped. His confession matched every detail: the way Rebecca lay, the location of the blood, the missing items, the time, things only the perpetrator would know. The day William Miller was extradited back to Arkansas, it was a light rain. It was a gloomy morning, very much like the mood of those who had waited 16 years for this moment. But they had not come to celebrate. They had come to see with their own eyes the face of the man they had always believed existed, the man who had taken Rebecca Gould, then hidden behind the walls of time, oblivion, and indifference of the system. Miller was taken to prison and charged with first-degree murder. Although he confessed to the crime during his interrogation in Oregon, when he stood before the court in Arkansas, he suddenly declared not guilty. Once again, he played a double game. This time, he had a defense attorney, time, and the right to remain silent. And if the court did not allow the use of the interrogation video, everything could collapse in just one hearing. Rebecca's family was stunned when they heard that Miller had withdrawn his confession. They feared a repeat of the nightmare. He would escape again. He would go abroad, continue to live as a father, a husband, while Rebecca had been buried for nearly 2 decades. Prosecutors were forced to fight to have the video confession used in court. They argued Miller had given his confession voluntarily, without coercion or inducement. He had been fully informed of his rights, and he had agreed to take a polygraph test. The court scrutinized it carefully, every question, every look, every voice on the tape. The judge finally ruled the video was admissible as evidence. It was a turning point. There was no DNA. There was no murder weapon. But there was a man who confessed in detail and with a clear motive: obsession, loss of control, homicidal instinct. Under pressure from the evidence, William Miller offered a plea deal. If he agreed to confess everything in court, he would receive a 40-year sentence instead of life without parole or the death penalty. In November 2022, William Miller was sentenced to 40 years in prison for first-degree murder. When the judge read the verdict, the courtroom was deathly silent. There was no applause. No thanks. Only the muffled sobs of Rebecca's mother and the bitter looks in the eyes of her sisters, because none of them believed that 40 years in prison, or any prison sentence, could compare to the loss they had endured. Just a few weeks after entering prison, Miller, perhaps haunted, or perhaps because he felt he had nothing left to lose, confessed something even more horrifying. He had killed 5 more women. He couldn't remember their names. He only remembered that they all looked like Rebecca, young, blonde, and petite. He said he had tricked them into his car, driven them into the woods, and then murdered them, not out of spite, not for money, simply driven by an uncontrollable desire. Investigators were horrified. They began combing through missing persons cases hundreds of miles away, from Texas to Missouri. But there was no DNA, no bodies, no identities. The evidence was too thin to convict. Rebecca Gould, in the end, became the only known victim. Rebecca's family had thought that catching the killer would be the end of it. But they realized justice could not bring back the normal days, the hugs, the laughter, and Rebecca's invisible but vital presence. Miller may have been locked up behind 4 walls, but Rebecca had been in the ground since the others had barely graduated from college, and that pain, no sentence could ever erase it. Rebecca Gould died one day in the fall of 2004. But the silence that followed her death lasted 18 years, longer than she had lived. Her death was, in essence, more than a murder. It is a giant hole in the legal system, a collective failure, and a stark example of how crimes can be forgotten, without determined people who refuse to give up. Rebecca was not a celebrity. She was not a politician. She did not have millions of followers on social media. She was just a young student, away from home, who fell in love with the wrong person, opened the wrong door, and paid the price with her life. But because Rebecca was so ordinary, her death became a symbol for thousands of other anonymous women, who were also murdered, also buried in cold case files, also remembered by no one outside their families. Rebecca's case shows that real power comes not from the courtroom, but from a journalist who refuses to be silenced. George Jared, a former cop who is not bound by the limits of his title. Jennifer Buckles, an online community that is skeptical, speculative, and demanding of the truth. Without them, William Miller would still be living in the Philippines, posting family photos on Facebook, drinking beer, and reading about missing women as if they had nothing to do with him. William Miller is not a Hollywood serial killer. He has no torture chamber. He has no markings. He has no letters challenging the police. He is a normal man, like your friend, like a relative you once invited to your house, and that is what is terrifying. He does not kill for money. Not for revenge. Not out of necessity. He kills just because. He wants to kill. His evil has no shape, no reason. It was all about opportunity. And Rebecca, in that fateful moment, was the unfortunate person standing right in front of that opportunity. The case became a typical example of a type of criminal that is much more dangerous than the reasonable one, the one who kills for pleasure, for sick instincts, for an innate loss of control, and is often good at hiding it. The Rebecca Gould case forced the American legal profession to look back at itself. Obvious errors, failing to thoroughly investigate all the victim's acquaintances, failing to seize the suspect's car, failing to take a DNA sample, failing to track William Miller's movements even though he was present at the scene. There was no mechanism to review the case for years, despite its many murky details, and worst of all, the police had all but given up. Without the online community, the case might never have been solved. Rebecca has now gotten justice. Not complete, but enough to rest in peace. William Miller is now in prison, not because he turned himself in, but because he was forced to confront the very things he thought he had hidden. But the last thing we have to admit is this: Rebecca Gould may have been one of thousands of victims killed because she went in the wrong door, trusted the wrong person, or simply looked like the killer's ideal. The Rebecca Gould case is not just a solved murder. It is a story of perseverance, of non-police officers who pursued the killer, of a community that cannot rest when a girl is dumped on the side of the road. And if there is one final message worth taking away, it is this: justice may be late, but it will only come if some refuse to let it be buried.